When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I was buying a slice of peace and quiet, a place where I could enjoy my early retirement with fishing rods leaning against the garage wall, long evenings on the porch, and mornings when the mist still hung low over the water that curled around the edge of our community. What I didn't realize at the time was that this particular neighborhood had an HOA that behaved less like a group of volunteers trying to maintain property values and more like a small dictatorship run by a power hungry board led by a woman named Karen. Yes, her real name. The HOA's obsession with rules bordered on lunacy. Lawn must be exactly 3 inches, trash cans visible for no more than 3 minutes before or after pickup, holiday decorations no sooner than 7 days before and no later than 7 days after, and God forbid you try to repaint your mailbox without filling out a 14-page request form. At first, I tried to play along because I didn't want to make enemies and because I figured it wasn't worth the trouble. But the real breaking point came the day they slapped me with a $3,500 fine for fishing in community waters without permission. That's right, fishing. In a lake that wrapped around the neighborhood, a lake that had been one of the major selling points for the house I bought, and a lake that was stocked with fish precisely because residents were supposed to enjoy it. They called it a protected waterway, and when I tried to argue that the rules never said I couldn't fish, they pulled out a 300-page HOA manual and pointed to an obscure clause that said, "Fishing shall be allowed only with the express prior written consent of the HOA board." Written consent for fishing in a lake attached to my property. I laughed at first, thinking they had to be joking, but no, they were deadly serious. The letter they sent me listed unauthorized fishing activity along with a calculated fine of $500 per violation, and apparently they had counted 7 times, thanks to some nosy neighbor who apparently tracked my fishing trips like I was some kind of criminal. My gut reaction was outrage, of course, but when I went to the board meeting to dispute it, things went from bad to worse. They sat me down like a schoolboy, Karen at the head of the table with her smug little smile, flanked by 2 men who looked like they lived for petty authority. I laid out my argument calmly that the lake was on my property line, that fishing was a harmless hobby, that their fine was absurd. But they didn't care. They just repeated over and over, rules are rules, until I finally realized that no matter how much sense I made, they had no intention of backing down. Then Karen leaned back in her chair, laced her fingers behind her head, and said with a smirk, "If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the neighborhood for you." That was the moment something in me snapped. Because here's the thing, I wasn't some powerless retiree living off Social Security. I had spent my career in engineering, managing water systems and infrastructure projects for municipalities. I knew water rights, I knew dam systems, and I knew exactly how these lakes and streams were fed and regulated. And more importantly, thanks to a combination of good investments and a generous retirement package, I had money, enough money to not just pay their fine, but to fight back in ways they couldn't imagine. So, I walked out of that meeting without saying another word, but with a plan already forming in my head. I went home, pulled out my old contacts list, and within a week, I had coffee scheduled with an old colleague who still worked with the county water board. Over black coffee in a dingy diner, I asked him a simple question: who actually owns the dam that feeds the lake in my neighborhood? He raised an eyebrow, chuckled, and pulled up some records on his tablet. The answer? A private landowner, a farmer who had inherited the property and was looking to sell off parts of it. The dam wasn't maintained by the county, wasn't under the HOA's control, and wasn't part of any government conservation program. It was a piece of private infrastructure, and it was up for grabs. My colleague leaned forward and said, "Why? You thinking about buying a dam?" I just smiled. 2 weeks later, after some paperwork, a wire transfer, and a handshake, I was the proud owner of the dam that fed every drop of water into that lake the HOA guarded so fiercely. They had fined me $3,500 for fishing, but now I held in my hands the literal key to their water supply, and I had no intention of being generous. Owning that dam gave me a kind of power that no HOA handbook or smugly worded fine could compete with, and the first thing I did was take a long drive out to it one morning just to stand on the concrete lip and listen to the roar of the spillway. The water thundered into the riverbed below, feeding into the streams and creeks that wound their way toward the neighborhood lake. And as I looked out across the shimmering surface of the reservoir behind me, I felt a rush of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Here was the source, the beating heart of everything they thought they controlled, and now it belonged to me. I didn't act right away. Revenge, I knew, is best served not just cold, but carefully prepared. So I spent the next few weeks quietly setting things in motion, reviewing the dam's maintenance records, hiring a small crew under the guise of safety inspections, and drafting up a legal notice that would soon change everything. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood carried on with the HOA's usual pettiness. They sent me another letter reminding me that my mailbox paint was not fully compliant with community aesthetic standards, even though it was the exact same shade of black as everyone else's. Karen even stopped by one afternoon, strutting up my driveway like she owned the place, wagging her finger as she reminded me that my fine was still due and that failure to pay would result in legal action. I bit my tongue, nodded, and told her I was taking care of it. She smirked, thinking she had me beat, while in reality I was just counting down the days until the tables turned. Then came the HOA's summer kickoff event, a lakeside garden party complete with catered food, white tents, and their usual self-congratulatory speeches about preserving community values. I watched from my porch as golf carts and SUVs rolled in, their passengers dressed like they were attending some country club gala instead of a backyard gathering. It was the perfect stage for what I had planned. 2 days before the party, I had my crew install a new gate system at the dam, one that could be closed manually to divert water away from the streams feeding the lake. It wasn't permanent damage. It was just a simple rerouting of flow into a bypass channel that emptied further downstream, harmless to anyone but the HOA. On the morning of the party, I drove out to the dam, turned the crank, and watched as the streams that usually fed the neighborhood slowed to a trickle. By midday, the lake levels had already begun to dip, and by the time the guests arrived in their press polos and sundresses, the once sparkling waterfront looked like a muddy, receding puddle. I stayed out of sight, of course, but word spread fast. I could hear the shouts from across the water. People pointing at their boats, now resting in muck, kids asking why the fish were flopping in the shallows, and Karen, red-faced and frantic, barking orders at anyone who would listen. By sunset, the party had dissolved into chaos, guests leaving early as the smell of exposed algae filled the air. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of angry emails from the HOA accusing me of tampering with community property and sabotaging the neighborhood's water supply. That was when I struck. I sent them an official notice stamped and signed by my attorney, informing them that the dam, and therefore the water feeding their lake, was now privately owned by me. I explained in no uncertain terms that I was under no obligation to supply their lake with water, that any continued access was a privilege, and that their behavior toward me, including the outrageous fine, would directly determine whether that privilege continued. You could practically hear the panic in their reply. They tried to puff their chests, threatening legal action, but the problem was they had no legal ground to stand on. The dam wasn't theirs, never had been, and when they finally consulted with the county, they learned what I had already confirmed. I was well within my rights to divert the water. Karen even showed up at my door, her smugness replaced with desperation. "You can't just do this," she shrieked, her voice cracking as neighbors hovered nearby, watching the confrontation. "You're destroying our community." I calmly reminded her that fishing in the lake was considered a violation, and since the lake was no longer being supplied, it seemed to me the problem had solved itself. Then I leaned in slightly and whispered, "Maybe this isn't the neighborhood for you." The look on her face was priceless, pure fury, mixed with the dawning realization that she had picked the wrong person to mess with. Over the next week, the lake shrank to half its normal size, docks sat crooked in the mud, and property values, the very thing the HOA existed to protect, plummeted. Neighbors who had once glared at me for daring to fish were now glaring at Karen and the board for letting their power games cost them the lake. Some even stopped me to quietly thank me, saying it was about time someone put the HOA in their place. But I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. I had shown them I had the power to shut off their water, but what came next would prove I could just as easily turn their entire system upside down if they didn't change their ways. Once the lake began to recede and the neighborhood's mood shifted from smug complacency to frenzied uncertainty, I doubled down on the pressure, but I did it smart, legally, and with a theater that would make Hollywood proud. I hired a civil engineer to write a formal report on the dam's condition and the potential liabilities of an improperly managed private water source. Then I leaked that report, carefully redacted to protect my own privacy, to a local paper with a good investigative reporter who loved a David versus Goliath story. The headline the next morning about private dam, public panic sent ripples through the community and put the HOA on the defensive in a way no angry email ever could. With the paper sniffing around, the HOA scrambled to find solutions. They contacted their lawyers, they convened emergency board meetings, and they called county officials to pressure them into declaring some sort of eminent domain or public safety takeover. Requests that fell flat once the county reviewed zoning maps and property deeds and found nothing giving them authority to seize or compel water release. Meanwhile, I played the patient hand. I agreed to release a measured flow of water back into the streams, enough to keep lawns from outright dying, but not enough to restore the lake to its former party-ready sparkle. It was a show of mercy, but it came with terms. I demanded in writing and witnessed by half the neighborhood that the HOA rescind the $3,500 fishing fine, publicly apologize for their harassment, and enact a new, transparent community agreement that prevented future arbitrary enforcement. I also required that Karen and the board undergo a mediation session with a neutral third party and that any future rule changes be approved by a 2/3 vote of homeowners, not the small clique that had been running the show. Their initial response was predictable: outrage, bluster, and threats. But that was before the paper printed interviews with homeowners who had lost rental bookings because their waterfront photos now showed mudflats, and before a boutique real estate agent called to warn the board that listings would stagnate if the lake issue wasn't resolved. Pressure came from sides I hadn't expected. Neighbors who had previously been complicit suddenly realized their property values were at stake and started calling for change. The turning point, ironically, came at a town hall meeting that the HOA had scheduled to address resident concerns. I showed up early not to be confrontational, but to document everything. I brought printed copies of the dam report, the legal notice declaring my ownership, and dozens of emails showing the board's heavy-handed enforcement actions, including the fishing fines and other petty citations. When the meeting began, Karen tried to read from a prepared statement about community stewardship, but she stumbled when a homeowner asked whether she had consulted water law experts before issuing fines. The room filled with murmurs as people connected the dots. The board had been wielding its power not just to enforce community standards, but to protect social cliques and punish anyone who stepped out of line. A couple of homeowners stood up and demanded a new election. A few more asked for an audit of HOA finances. The pressure mounted until Karen, who had always assumed her position was unassailable, finally lost her nerve and resigned on the spot, an outcome no one had expected, least of all her. Her departure was cathartic for many, but I didn't gloat. Instead, I used the moment to push for structural change. I helped organize an emergency homeowners meeting where we voted in a temporary oversight committee composed of homeowners with diverse backgrounds, teachers, a nurse, a retired judge, and yes, me, tasked with drafting fair rules and reworking the enforcement process, so it wasn't a tool of intimidation. The committee's first act was to rescind the fishing fine and issue a public apology to me. They also voted to create a clear permit process for lake activities that couldn't be weaponized by a single person. With the immediate crisis easing, the county finally agreed to perform a safety inspection of the dam itself and mandated a maintenance plan that I agreed to fund on the condition that the HOA signed the new community covenant we had drafted, including the 2/3 rule for major decisions and an independent appeals process for fines. It was a bitter pill for the old guard, but sensible homeowners recognized the value in transparency and accountability. In the weeks that followed, neighbors who had once whispered behind curtains started inviting one another over again, but the dynamic had changed. Conversations around the lake now included talk of bylaws, open records, and mutual respect, words that had been absent during Karen's era. I used the media attention to highlight a broader issue: the danger of small groups accumulating unchecked power in supposedly democratic community organizations. I did not seek to destroy the HOA, only to reform it so it served everyone fairly instead of a privileged few. Still, not everyone was pleased with my tactics. A handful of holdouts accused me of grandstanding, of weaponizing my financial advantage to humiliate others. I understood their resentment. My methods had been drastic, but I reminded them that the alternative was a neighborhood where petty tyranny went unchallenged. There was also a personal cost. I lost a few friends who felt I had escalated things too far, and late at night, I sometimes questioned whether I had crossed a line from righteous pushback into vindictiveness. Those doubts were human, but they were fleeting because the sight of children again fishing from a restored but responsibly managed dock, and doing so without fear of being fined into oblivion, was a quiet vindication. As the lake regained equilibrium under the new maintenance plan, I kept one small bargaining chip: a clause that allowed me to step in if the HOA ever again attempted to arbitrarily punish residents or to seize control of communal resources for personal gain. It wasn't a spiteful demand, it was a safeguard. The neighborhood had learned its lesson the hard way, and while some scars remained, social fractures that would take time to mend, the balance of power had shifted back toward fairness. I had started out wanting only to be left alone to cast my line in peace, but what I ended up changing was the very governance of the community. In doing so, I discovered that sometimes the only way to fix a corrupt little system is to show it the consequences of its cruelty, and sometimes the only way to be an ally to a community is to become its inconvenient guardian. The aftermath of the whole saga left me standing on the dam one quiet morning, fishing rod in hand, reflecting on how far things had spiraled from a simple $3,500 fine. I hadn't set out to become the neighborhood's reluctant crusader, yet here I was, holding both the literal and metaphorical keys to the water supply that once symbolized the HOA's unchecked control and now represented something entirely different: balance, accountability, and the power of standing up to bullies no matter the scale. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though it was a new kind of normal. Gone were the days when Karen could stroll down the street with her smug clipboard, writing up neighbors for trivialities, and in her place was a board that listened because it had to. Its credibility rested on transparency, and its authority now came from genuine consensus rather than intimidation. The first test of this new order came with autumn, when the issue of dock repairs arose. Previously, the HOA would have simply issued a mandate and billed everyone equally without explanation. But this time, the Oversight Committee presented detailed cost estimates, solicited homeowner input, and allowed residents to vote on options ranging from full replacement to phased repair. The process was messy, with heated debates and competing preferences, but in the end, the decision reflected the majority rather than the whims of a few, and though not everyone got exactly what they wanted, most felt respected in the process. And that respect was something new, something fragile but worth protecting. For me personally, the vindication wasn't in winning or humiliating Karen. Though I admit I took quiet satisfaction every time I walked past her house and saw the for sale sign that went up a few months later. The real victory came when I saw kids once again laughing as they cast their lines into a lake that was now thriving under a structured, sustainable water management plan, one that I oversaw not as a tyrant, but as a steward. I established a simple fishing permit system that cost nothing and only asked that residents log their catches so we could track fish populations and ensure the lake remained healthy. People who had once viewed me as a troublemaker now approached me with questions, ideas, and sometimes just a friendly wave. Fences that had divided neighbors literally and figuratively began to come down, and block parties, real, neighborly block parties, not HOA-mandated galas, sprang up to replace the stiff, performative events that Karen used to orchestrate. Looking back, It still amazed me how much one act of arrogance, a $3,500 fine for something as harmless as fishing, had ignited such a transformation. But perhaps it was inevitable. People will tolerate small injustices until one day someone says enough, and once that dam bursts, pun fully intended, the tide cannot be stopped. Even so, I didn't romanticize it too much. There were still scars, still neighbors who avoided eye contact because they'd been too loyal to the old guard, still whispers that maybe I had gone too far by cutting off the water and attracting the press. But I also knew that nothing meaningful changes without discomfort, and that if I had simply paid the fine and kept quiet, the cycle of abuse would have continued until someone else suffered worse. I often wondered what Karen thought when she drove past the lake in its renewed state, if she regretted pushing me, if she realized how her hunger for control had been her undoing, or if she still fumed, convinced she had been wronged. But in truth, it didn't matter anymore. She was gone, the board had changed, and the community had found its footing again. In the evenings, as the sun set and the lake reflected orange and gold, I would sit with my rod, listening to the gentle splash of water returning to its rightful place, and I felt a calm I hadn't known since moving here. I didn't need parades or recognition. My revenge had never been about glory, it had been about dignity, mine and everyone else's who had been silenced by petty tyrants. And, in a poetic twist, the very thing they had tried to take from me, fishing, became the symbol of freedom for the neighborhood. Kids learning patience on the docks, retirees finding peace by the shore, families gathering around grills after day by the water. What started as an absurd $3,500 penalty had ended with an entire community rethinking how power should be wielded. And though I knew there would always be challenges, always be disagreements, I also knew that the days of arbitrary fines and iron-fisted rule were over. The dam still stood, solid and humming with power, but now it was more than just concrete and steel. It was a reminder of how one person's stand can ripple outward, reshaping the currents of a whole community. For me, it was the sweetest revenge of all, not just shutting off their water, but teaching them that respect, fairness, and accountability were the only foundations strong enough to hold back the flood.